All right, so it's 6:03. If you're a little late, that's okay. We will start. So welcome to the Data Town Hall. This is Accountability for Dearborn's first Data Town Hall, and we are doing it in partnership with Detroit Justice Center, so we're very thankful for that. And we're so happy to be in community with you all, learning from each other, to work locally toward a better world. That's really awesome. So first I'm going to set expectations. We have non-negotiables. Racism is real. It is a current issue and it impacts individuals and communities. Lived experiences are valid sources of knowledge. And finally, the impact of legislation, policies, budgetary decisions, and actions matter more than intention. And now I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. I'm Alejandra Carrillo, and I've lived in Dearborn for a super long time. And I will now pass it over to Beth Bailey to introduce herself briefly.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Beth Bailey. I'm also with Accountability for Dearborn. I've lived in Dearborn for about 7 years. I'm also a third-generation Dearbornite. So my mom grew up in Dearborn, as did both of her parents. During my day job, I'm a researcher. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am, again, very excited and very happy to be learning in community with you today.
Thank you, Beth. Now I'll pass it on to Erin from Detroit Justice Center.
Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Keefe. I'm a staff attorney in the Legal Services and Advocacy practice at the Detroit Justice Center. We've done a lot of work through our white paper to explore the ways that over-policing leads to what we call the traffic debt to incarceration pipeline, especially for Black and Brown people. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, but have seen firsthand what over-policing in Dearborn sometimes looks like. And so I'll turn it over to my colleague, Joe, who can give his own intro.
Hi, my name is Joe McGuire. I'm also a staff attorney for Detroit Justice Center, and I also happen to be from Dearborn. And I, like Erin, have represented many clients who have dealt with the Dearborn criminal justice system and the policing in Dearborn, and seen firsthand the effects of that.
Thank you so much for the introductions. We'll be hearing a lot more from these three amazing people. So I'll start by giving you the introduction. All right, so one of the most important parts of this work is understanding our community. Metro Detroit is one of the most racially segregated regions in the country. Dearborn's government and communities have played an active role in Metro Detroit's segregation. And despite bordering the city with the highest percentage of Black people in the nation, Dearborn has only a 4% Black population. And this is on purpose. And you will hear and understand more as we go on through this presentation. Shortly, we will explain how this present situation was carefully created by previous and current leaders, community members, and ultimately sustained by policies still in place today. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of policing. What does policing look like in the United States? We know from activists and researchers before us that policing does not make our communities safer. We also know that policing, a system originally established as slave patrol, is built to uphold white supremacy and the prioritization of property over human lives. Nationwide, policing maintains those values through ethnic and racial discrimination, harassment and murder of Black people, criminalization of poverty, the creation and maintenance of racial borders, police brutality, and a lack of transparency and accountability. This list is far from exhaustive, but based on our research, we began to look at ways to see how these practices were taking hold in Dearborn. And now I'll be passing it on to my colleague, Beth, to talk to you more about how we researched more on this in Dearborn.
Thank you so much, Lexi. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a researcher. And this summer, there was a lot of conversation about national trends of policing and the historic narrative of policing in the United States. And this really helped me realize that I had no idea how these trends were represented in my own community. So I started to wonder, is Dearborn par for the course? Is Dearborn the exception to these national level trends? And so research starts with a question. It starts with a question. For me, it started with, what does policing look like in Dearborn? And that broke down into looking at, how does policing connect with Dearborn's unique history? What are police resources used for? What issues receive police attention? How transparent is Dearborn police? And what are ways that Dearborn police officers are held accountable? So to answer these questions, I started to look for different sources of data. The first set that we looked into were historic data sources. Historic data provides context, and it allows us to situate Dearborn within the broader narrative of our region, our state, and our country. For historic data, we referenced archival documents at the Dearborn Historical Museum, newspaper articles, and books written on the history of Dearborn and our metro area. And our historical research allowed us to construct a timeline of race relations in Dearborn. This timeline pulls together research from multiple sources and incorporates national, statewide, regional, and Dearborn-specific events. And I know that there were a lot of registrants to this webinar who were interested in translating our work to your own communities. So following this presentation, you'll receive a set of documents, one of which is a timeline with the Dearborn specific events removed, but those state and national level events left in, so that you can start to construct this, something along these lines for your own community, to see how your community experiences race relations. One of the takeaways from this timeline is that I want everyone to take away from it that that racism in Dearborn and racial inequities in Dearborn have been constant, and they are still current. We often sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that we took a break from racism as a society. And the reality is that there's so much continuity here. At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I'm a third generation Dearbornite. So my presence here demonstrates that continuity. All right, next up, we took a look at contextualizing data sources. So contextualizing data sources allow us to interpret raw data. Contextualizing data sources allow us to give meaning to and create a narrative around the information that we find through statistics. These data sets included the police department's annual reports, the city's financial documents, scholarly journal articles, United States Census data, Dearborn City Charter, and the police blotter. And one of my first moments of understanding of policing in my city really came from an understanding of Dearborn's finances. So every year, Dearborn spends $41 million on policing, and that is 43% of Dearborn's general fund. And this has cost us some vital city services. So as a direct result of staffing requirements on the police department, Dearborn reduced non-emergency safety city employees by 35%. They eliminated the city's public health department, shut down 3 public pools, and closed the snow branch of the public library. And even with all of those cuts, that still wasn't enough to make up the full amount that staffing increases in policing were were causing. So on top of all of those budget cuts, we also see the instatement of a 3.5 mil property tax increase. So there's the price of policing, but there's also that cost of policing that I want us to keep in mind. Also important to the context is how Dearborn is situated in our region. And I found this map extremely striking. This map illustrates census data, and it also illustrates the culmination of the timeline that we saw earlier of all of those efforts to segregate Dearborn. You don't actually need the black lines around Dearborn in the north portion up here. You can just see where Dearborn ends and Detroit begins. Can also see down here more indications of that stark contrast between Dearborn and Detroit. You also don't need any lines to see where Inkster is. So when we say Metro Detroit is one of the most segregated regions in the country, this is what we're referring to, these extremely stark and set lines of racial segregation in our communities. So we also want to talk about the role of policy in establishing this map, in establishing and maintaining the segregation. And many of us have heard of de facto segregation, or the idea that racial segregation is a natural result of people tending to prefer to live around people who share their identity. The reality is, in Metro Detroit, we're living in a world that was created by de jure segregation. De jure, or by law, is segregation that exists because of local laws that mandate segregation. And this finding is very important as it really informs a major decision for our data collection. We realize that the racialized history and context of our region required that we come to understand policing from the perspective of how it impacts and is impacted by race. All right, and then the last set of data that we pulled together were our raw data sets. These data sets tell us about citations, arrests, and calls to service, and they provide insight into the activities and impacts of Dearborn's Police Department. And by bringing in these raw data together with the context and historical data, we were able to develop a narrative of policing in Dearborn's racial context. All right, so the first set is calls to service, and they represent calls made by the public or by other officers for police officers to address specific situations. When the call to service is issued, it's assigned to an officer based on proximity or patrol beat. And we received a listing of calls to service broken down by call type for each year, 2009 to 2020. Understanding calls to service provides insight into what kinds of situations Dearborn police are being brought into, and how our communities really perceive or understand the roles of the police. Next up, we also receive citation data. So citations are directives issued by police officers, typically in response to a civil infraction or a misdemeanor. We received a listing of all citations issued by Dearborn Police, broken down by issuing officer, as well as citation type, disaggregated by race and gender for each year, 2010 to 2019. And these data help us understand who's receiving tickets, what tickets are being issued, who is issuing the tickets, and allow us to look at trends. Finally, arrests. So arrests occur when somebody is taken into police custody, typically under suspicion that they have committed a criminal act. We received a list of arrests from 2009 to 2019, broken down by race and sex of the individual who's arrested, as well as the offense for which they were arrested. And these data, again, help us understand who's being arrested, what people are being arrested for, and what trends, again, we can see in these data. And as I mentioned before, these data sources don't stand on their own. They talk to each other. We come to understand them through each other. So when we look at the citations data alongside the calls to service, we come to really understand how the police are spending their time and resources. We can start to recognize race and gender disparities when we compare these data against census data. And we can start to see the perceived role of police in our communities through the narrative data provided by the police blotter that contextualizes data from calls to service. All right, so this is, I think, the portion that a lot of you came here for, to hear about the results of our data analysis. So we're going to talk about the significant trends that we found from each data set. It's important to keep in mind that none of these exist in a vacuum. Each trend is described alongside historic and contextual information. And this webinar today is really only going to provide a high-level overview of each finding. And we want to make sure that we invite you to attend our subsequent webinars, which will dig deeper into each data set. So we'll start with calls to service. Again, calls to service are where interactions with the police are often initiated, and they provide valuable insight into the types of issues that the police are called to address. For these results, we're looking at the period July 2009 to July 2020. And these data sets began and ended mid-year, which made it difficult to draw direct comparisons between calls to service data and the other sets of data. We still think that it's valuable to look at them alongside each other. Between July 2019 and July 2020, Dearborn Police recorded about 70,000 calls to service. And our first finding is that most calls to service were not related to crimes or criminal activities. We've actually been really intentional to use the language calls to service rather than reported crimes. This is because most calls to service were unrelated to crimes or criminal activities. In fact, 51% were not related to enforcement of any sort of civil or criminal violation of codes. 23% were related exclusively to civil traffic incidents, and then 26% were non-traffic incidents. Finding number 2 is that very few calls to service are dangerous. So we assess dangerous by whether a call brought an officer into a situation that would be more dangerous than someone going about their day might encounter. We found that about 10% of calls to service came with an increased risk of encountering dangerous circumstances. I do want to take a pause here and acknowledge that this finding may cause some cognitive dissonance. We know that there's a danger narrative that surrounds policing, and in our subsequent town halls, we are going to get more deep into where that narrative comes from and how it fails to square with reality. Finding number 3. Very few calls to service address violence. So when we assessed the data, we assessed it based on whether or not like a violent crime or a violent circumstance had been reported. And we found that a little bit less than 2% of the circumstances that officers were being called into were addressing violence. So that's about 1,400. We also took a look at the violent crimes reported to the FBI during that same period, and that number was 330. The reason that our number is a little bit bigger is because we included more calls to service types than the FBI includes in their definition. So the FBI defines violent crimes exclusively as homicide, rape, aggravated assault, and robbery. We chose to include non-aggravated assault and a few other offenses to give the broadest definition of violence as we could. All right, finding number 4. The police are being called to provide municipal and human services. Many of the calls to service recorded by the police department are related to circumstances that other communities and even our own community have identified as outside of the purview of the police department. So we see non-emergency traffic safety calls. We see municipal services calls, for example, removing road hazards, installing signs, and we see the administering of domestic, mental, and physical care services. Finding number 5, Dearborn police are focused on property and patrols. So 14% of calls to service were related to nonviolent property offenses. 14% were park and walk patrols, where officers surveil public areas with primary focus on schools and commercial areas. 60% of Dearborn's police force is employed in the patrol division. So it should really come as no surprise that 23% of all calls to service were related to traffic violations, and 88% of citations issued over the last 10 years were for traffic violations. So while we're on the topic of citations, let's continue. In each year of data we received, Dearborn Police issued approximately 30,000 citations, and these data were broken down by citation type, race, and gender of the recipient, as well as the name of the issuing officer. A few notes about the citation data that impacted our analysis. So the first and very relevant to Dearborn is the absence of ethnicity categories. So Arab Americans and Hispanic or Latinx folks are lumped into the white category. As a result, we were unable to identify patterns of discrimination that impact these communities. Also, prevalence of unknown race. So between 2010 to 2014, approximately 30% of the records indicated unknown race. Then around 2015, we see that number drop dramatically to be about 10 to 15% of citations written to a person of unknown race. We believe this may reflect a standardization of classifying Arab Americans as white. And then duplication of parking data. So every parking violation was recorded twice in the data that we received. Once as written to a white individual and once as written to an individual of unknown race. And so for the sake of analysis, we actually had to omit those data because they were garbage. All right. So finding number 1 from the citations data. Black people are over-ticketed by Dearborn Police, and it's been getting worse. So back to the census, approximately 3.3% of Dearborn's population is Black. In 2010, Black folks received 27% of citations in Dearborn. By 2019, that number had grown to 47.7% of citations. And we see an increase in the proportion of citations written to Black people each year, 2019 being the first year that Black people received more citations than white people. I should say white classified people. Finding number 2, Dearborn police are punishing poverty, and our friends from the Detroit Justice Center are going to cover this in much more detail during their portion. But preview. Every year since 2010, the top 4 categories of citations issued by Dearborn Police are fines issued for violations that resulted from individuals not being able to afford to upkeep or document their vehicles. Approximately 62% of all citations are this category. So citations for burnt out brake lights, citations for expired registration, those represent 62% of citations issued by Dearborn Police. Finding number 3, when Dearborn Police punish poverty, they punish Black people. In 2019, the categories of citations issued by the Dearborn Police Department with the highest proportion of Black recipients are overwhelmingly categories that indicate the presence of poverty or economic need. And between 2010 to 2019, Black folks were fined at least $17.6 million through the citation process. If Black folks were fined at a rate commensurate to their representation in Dearborn's population, this number would be closer to 2.4 million. Finding number 4, white women are underrepresented. White classified women comprise approximately 45% of Dearborn's population. However, in every year of the data, white women never represented more than 12.6% of citations. And while this may sound minor or like an odd thing to focus on, it's actually really telling. One of the defenses that we hear for these disparities in the citations numbers is that Black people come into Dearborn to shop or to work, so the citations numbers may be representative of Dearborn's daytime population. That does imply, when we look at the numbers of white classified women, that white women are leaving the city in droves during the day. Like 3/4 of all white women leave the city on foot or through tunnels every day. So important piece. Finding number 5, individual officer bias levels are varied. High bias goes unaddressed, and it gets worse over time. So as I mentioned earlier, we actually received the citations broken down by issuing officer. So we could see which officers were issuing 91% of their citations to Black people. And there were a few. About 12 officers in 2019 issued 70% or more of their citations to Black people. 73% of officers who had written citations during this time showed high racial bias, so racial bias of 40% or higher. Less than 3% of officers showed no racial bias, and about 24% showed low to moderate. We also broke this down by change in bias over time across all officers, and we saw that individual officers' bias levels tended to increase. Officers whose bias level increased, it increased more than corresponding officers may have had decreases in their bias. We also found that these officers who were issuing at these very high levels, at the 70s, 80s, 90s%, we saw that those officers had been on the force for multiple years, and we saw that this was a pattern amongst these officers. All right, and then I also wanted to bring up something that kind of struck a little bit of a hopeful chord with us, which is that citations with accountability show the lowest levels of anti-Black racial bias. So speeding violations showed the highest rate of issuance to white people, or white classified people, with at around 80%. So there's still some anti-Black racial bias represented there, but it's less than some of these other citations. The hypothesis there is that speed checking radar guns can partially compensate for the officer's individually held biases by providing an objective measurement. And then the only violation where white women were represented at a rate approximately commensurate with their proportion of the population was failure to yield damage accident. And it's possible that some of the characteristics of these citations that cause that more fair distribution is that there's multiple parties who receive a report when there's a damage accident, so insurance gets involved, and there's physical evidence that it occurred. All right, and then finally, of the data sets is the arrest data. So the arrest data that we received were for the years 2009 to 2019. These data were broken down by arrest reason, race, and gender of arrestee. We did not receive the identities of the arresting officers. A few notes that impacted our analysis. First, again, the absence of ethnicity categories. So Arab Americans and Hispanic or Latinx folks are, again, recorded simply as white. So we're not able to identify trends of harm to those communities. This is especially relevant when we saw the rate of arrests for the reason immigration. That came up as 98% white, and it seems like there's a piece of the story missing in that case. Also, the fact that the most common reason for arrest was simply listed as warrants. This doesn't give us insight into the reason that the interaction with the officer was initiated, nor does it give us information about what type of charges were outstanding against the individual. And again, this is a little bit of a preview for our Detroit Justice Center friends. So finding number 1, the majority of arrests by Dearborn police are of Black people, and it's been getting worse. Less than 4% of Dearborn's population is Black. However, in 2019, Black people were 58.6% of people arrested in Dearborn. This is up from 48.6% in 2009, and we have seen a steady increase over that period. Finding number 2. Most arrests were conducted by, or are conducted by, Dearborn PD's Border Crimes Initiative team. And you may be surprised to learn that we have a Border Crimes Initiative team, despite not having an international, state, or county border. We do share a border with Detroit, so that certainly seems to be an implication there. This team's mission, as defined by the police department's annual report, is to pull over and arrest as many people as possible through street searches. And this is really based on, this mission is defined by a misguided belief in what has been proven to be ineffective and harmful broken windows policing. We'll get a little bit more into the harm caused by broken windows policing in a later webinar, but big takeaway is that 73% of arrests were conducted by the border crimes team. Finding number 3, very few arrests by Dearborn police occur in response to violent crimes. And this is again using Accountability for Dearborn's much broader definition of violent crimes, not the FBI's definition, which is much narrower and would represent an even smaller portion of data. The vast majority of arrests occurred as a result of unrelated interactions, traffic incidents, and nonviolent property crimes. Finding number 4, decriminalizing nonviolent behavior reduces arrests. And this is another kind of hopeful one because it shows us a little bit of a way forward. We know that in 2019, Michigan legalized the recreational use of marijuana. And we see that have an impact pretty much immediately, where in 2018, there were 790 arrests for drug-related reasons. That was 2018. In 2019, we see less than 300. Now, these arrests aren't broken down by substance type. So we don't know how many of those 790 were for marijuana-related offenses. We do also see this trend in citations data, which is broken down by substance type, where we see a few hundred citations written for marijuana use in 2018, and then like 2 written for marijuana use in 2019. All right, and then finding number 5. And this is arrests occur when Dearborn police interact with an individual for other reasons. 25% of all arrests occurred because the officer interacted with a civilian for another reason and identified an outstanding arrest or bench warrant. This is part of a cycle of poverty that is created and sustained by the criminal justice system. When we look at these data alongside the citations, we see that this is reflective of a known nationwide pattern of progressively worsening outcomes for Black people at every step of the criminal justice system. We see bias against Black folks increasing. When Black folks make up 47.7% of citations, we see Black folks making up 58.6% of arrests. So we see the proportion of Black folks growing. And the warrants category gives us a clue of what's going on there. So we see that outstanding warrants that result from citations result in arrests. And when one group is overrepresented in citations, that's going to naturally feed into representation along arrests. All right, so to help us contextualize some of this data, we're actually going to turn it over to our friends from the Detroit Justice Center. And they're going to talk about their research and how it ties into what we're doing. So I will control the screen to you guys.
Hello, hi, my name's Joe McGuire. As I said at the beginning, I'm a staff attorney with Detroit Justice Center. I'll be speaking tonight with my colleague Aaron Keith. And so we are attorneys who, we do a lot of things at Detroit Justice Center. We have a focus on racial justice, and the organization kind of grew out of a lot of the work, the movement work coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, and listening to people in that movement about what they would need from an organization like Detroit Justice Center. And one thing that is unignorable is that a lot of horrible experiences with police, racist police, and violent police starts out as a traffic stop. And so it makes sense to focus on that. So one of the things we do at Detroit Justice Center is help out people with their driving records and with traffic warrants and misdemeanors and traffic tickets to enable them to drive legally and clear whatever warrants or criminal matters they have related to traffic. So we've seen a lot. And I can tell you that we really appreciate Accountability for Dearborn, because even though we've seen a lot, and we obviously know about these problems, it's another thing to see the data and the stark outrageousness of the data, especially about Dearborn. I think we need to acknowledge that right off the bat. I think that was a really great presentation. But you know, if that doesn't make you mad, you weren't listening close enough. The disparities between the Black population and the arrestees, the race of the arrestees in Dearborn is just outrageous. And so we're here to kind of walk you through more facts about how traffic tickets and traffic court work and how they don't work for justice. Let me just go to the next slide here. So when you talk about traffic tickets, you're probably thinking about speeding tickets and, you know, running red lights, you know, stuff that, well, you know, maybe police have to pull certain people over because, you know, if someone's driving dangerously in your city, you can't just ignore that. Well, you might be surprised to learn that when we take a look at someone's driving record and see what kind of tickets they get, the vast majority of them have nothing to do with driving. They have nothing to do with public safety. You see over and over again tickets that essentially criminalize poverty. So what you're looking at here is just a few offenses related. You'll see these, they're listed as equipment violations on the ticket. And often they are, you know, a busted tail light, you know, a bumper that's kind of hanging off. And technically, you know, you can pull somebody over. And once you pull somebody over, you can run their license. And once you run their license, you know, you can see if they have car insurance and proof of car insurance. And so that is an easy way for police to target poor people and Black people in the suburbs and in Detroit as well. So you also see expired plate on there. You'll see tickets for driving without insurance. Now, we all know how incredibly unaffordable insurance is in this area. And so if you are in poverty, and especially if you live in Detroit, insurance, car insurance is extremely out of your reach. And so that is a very common ticket to see, driving without insurance. Driving an unregistered vehicle, of course, it costs money to register a vehicle. Driving without a license, driving with a suspended license. And this is what really creates a cycle, is that someone will get a ticket, or maybe, you know, they'll get pulled over, and then they'll get a handful of tickets. And they are unable to pay those tickets because they don't have the money. And what happens if you're unable to pay a ticket? or maybe you miss a court date because you didn't get the notice or you were afraid of getting locked up. If you showed up for the court date and told the judge you weren't able to pay the tickets, what happens is that they suspend your license automatically. The Secretary of State will suspend your driver's license, and then it is illegal for you to drive at all anywhere in the state of Michigan. And so that gives police another thing to ticket you for, and that is a misdemeanor crime, which means that you can be arrested and put in jail and for that, even though you're not doing anything that is endangering anyone or anything like that. And it really was just from your own inability to pay some fines and fees and costs. So, I think this kind of data is very important for challenging a lot of assumptions about what people are getting pulled over for. And I think it was very important what the Accountability for Dearborn presentation said about the disparity being less, the racial disparity being less when you look at speeding tickets. Because when you look at speeding tickets, well, that is, something that is often, detected with a radar detector, and it's relatively objective. And it actually, you could make the argument that it does actually endanger people. And that is one where the racial disparity is much less. Meanwhile, you have these tickets and misdemeanors that really don't endanger anyone in the city and mostly criminalize poverty. And that is where you see the largest racial disparity. And so, a lot of our focus is trying to get these decriminalized, and we'll go into that a little bit more later. So next, for the next slide, I think Erin's going to talk about it. So let me just switch the slide over.
Go back one more, Joe.
Oh, did I go too far?
Yep.
There we go.
All good. All right. So as Joe explained, there are many reasons why people need to drive. And so although many Black people live in the city of Detroit, many of them are commuting to neighboring suburbs, including Dearborn, for a plethora of different reasons. 64% of working Detroiters commute to the suburbs for work. 112,000 Detroiters commute outside of the city for work, 36% for jobs that pay less than $15,000 per year. Only 49,000 Detroiters both live and work in the city. Detroiters go to the suburbs for essential food and healthcare needs. Detroit has some of the worst access to healthcare, including primary care providers, than the neighboring suburbs. And then, of course, public transit between the suburbs and Detroit has been constantly fought by suburban governments. One example of this is Dearborn's East End being serviced by DDOT and West End being serviced by SMART. There is no direct bus line from Detroit to Henry Ford Community College or University of Michigan, Dearborn. And so you see a lot of these barriers to people being able to come back and forth in a way that doesn't require a vehicle. And that's been done on purpose to keep, people of color, specifically Black people who are from Detroit, from being where they're not supposed to be, being in a sundown town. And so we can go to the next slide. So it's, one more back. Back again. Yep, perfect. So case study, driving while poor. So it's really important to understand what are the barriers to driving legally and why we say we keep throwing around this concept of making it a crime to be poor, but it's important to unpack this. So a couple of things to note. Back in the day, driver's education in schools was kind of standard course. It's not anymore. So a common issue that comes up a lot is that because there's no driver's education in many of our public schools, especially Detroit public schools, that becomes a barrier to getting a permit to even begin to learn how to drive. Unaffordable car repairs, we've discussed that at length. Then you compound that with unaffordable tickets for the repairs, and then unaffordable insurance. Additionally, suspended licenses for unpaid tickets make it even more daunting to actually get out of the debt once you're in it. In addition to that, there's the need to drive. So again, no reliable public transit, only available jobs are in another city, inadequate access to essentials, inability to move. So for many people, there are lots of reasons why they need to drive. One of the largest things I like to think about is people will say, well, if you live in Detroit or the Metro Detroit area, it's kind of a no-brainer that you can get a job at a plant. Well, where are the plants located? Okay, many of them are in the suburbs. So how would you even get to a job if you cannot drive to that job? And then, of course, there's the physical disabilities that come with needing to drive. Sometimes people assume that, you know, it's easy to get on a public bus, but let's say that public bus doesn't have a wheelchair lift, or you can't even walk, you're not mobile, you can't walk to the bus stop at all. You know, it might be easier to have someone in your household drive you from point A to point B, or for you to drive yourself. So all of these things kind of compound, making it a crime to be poor, because you have the barriers to driving legally, the need to drive, it being a necessity, and then you have no other choice but to drive. So we can go to the next slide. In addition to that, there are disparities in policing and laws that criminalize poverty and trap people in local criminal courts. So minor traffic offenses, not including DUIs, account for half of all criminal prosecutions in Michigan courts. Driving with a suspended license is the third most common reason for admission into our local county jails. 12% of all arrests of Black men and 15% of all arrests of Black women are for driving on a suspended license, compared to only 6% for both white men and women. These same problems apply to other minor offenses like shoplifting and possession of drugs, but a huge portion of city-level prosecutions are for criminal traffic matters, things that many people would be surprised to realize were even crimes. So I think that slide is pretty much self-sufficient and self-explanatory. Go ahead.
Thanks, Erin. And so when we look at what motivates cities like Dearborn to do this, we see not only, you know, the motives you might consider, like, you know, sort of policing the borders as accountability for racial harassment, but we also see a financial motivation, which is that, of course, when a city like Dearborn does collect fines and fees and court costs and other things from people that they pull over and ticket, that goes into city coffers, and it goes into district court coffers. And so when you look at Dearborn's district court, that's a court that handles traffic matters. We have our 19th district court over on Michigan Avenue. It's a very pretty white building. And their own budgets show that they cost the city about $3.5 million, but brought in $4 million in revenue. So that's a nice little profit, right? Then you look at Hazel Park's district court. They brought in a revenue of $3.2 million, despite having only $1.3 million in operating expenses. That's a profit of nearly $2 million for the city of Hazel Park. When you look at Ferndale, you have a revenue of $3.5 million. That's 15% of the city's total revenue. And the cost that the court incurs to the city is only $2.8 million. Then finally you have Madison Heights with a revenue of $1.7 million and only $1.4 million in costs. And so what we're seeing here is a tax on the poor and the minority population that either lives in Dearborn or is unlucky enough to have to pass through Dearborn. That these district courts and cities are collecting money from the very people who are least able to afford it, to fund the city itself, to fund the district courts. And this is very important because it creates a motivation on these city workers, the court staff, the judges, the prosecutors, and the police to ticket more people and to bring in more revenue. And this isn't speculation. We can see ourselves. So this is a quote from an amicus brief, and that's basically a legal document that someone can file with the court in a case that they're not involved in, but you want to sort of put your word in. And this was filed by the Michigan District Judges Association. So these are the judges themselves saying this. And they say the court funding system created by the legislature unconstitutionally shifts the funding burden onto the courts and creates an inherent conflict of interests in the judges who have to simultaneously determine guilt or innocence while forcing those same judges to fund their courts by assessing costs against defendants who have pled guilty or who have been found guilty of a criminal offense. The constant pressure to balance the court's budgets could have a subconscious impact on even the most righteous judge. Now, that is some generous language there from the District Court Judges Association, but you see what they're saying. If the district court judges know that the city, which is their funding arm, for example, Dearborn is the funding body for the 19th District Court, if they know that the city, which funds them, is breathing down their neck on them and pressuring them to bring in more revenue, and if you don't bring in revenue, maybe next year we're not going to fund your court as much, then of course that creates an incentive on you, the district court judge, to impose more fines and fees, to maybe put more pressure on people to pay, maybe issue some more warrants on people, some more bench warrants, and especially not inform people that they have a right to ask the court for alternate ways to deal with their sentence, which is in Michigan law. The Michigan court rules allow a defendant in, for example, a traffic court case to plead to the court that, hey, I can't afford to pay this in money. Is there some other way we can work this out? Maybe community service, maybe you can write off some of the fines and fees. That's in there. And so district court judges could inform defendants of their rights under that, but oftentimes they don't. And this kind of explains why many of the judges don't, because they know that unless they bring in some money, they have to worry about continued funding for their courts. And so you have a situation where the courts that are supposed to be the neutral arbiters of what's best, and who's guilty and who's not, and what's a fair sentence, what is, best for society in general, is instead really thinking of what's best for the city coffers, right? And that trickles down to everybody. And so it is an inherently biased system against defendants. And so we already talked about we already showed a table with some of the tickets people get with the fines and fee amounts, but that only covers part of the money that people have to pay once they get traffic tickets. There's also fees and costs. So you not only have to pay, the $150 or $200 for your, driving without insurance ticket, but you also have to pay costs and fees on top of that. So, for example, if you have a court-appointed attorney, you have to pay for that. That is not actually free. And then they add on a crime victims' rights assessment for misdemeanors. Now, keep in mind, the misdemeanors we're talking about are most commonly driving on a suspended license and driving without insurance. But there is a crime victims' rights assessment assessed on all of those. And judges will throw up their hands and say, I have to do it, even though I sort of question who exactly is the victim in a no insurance ticket. Is it the insurance company that's the victim? I don't know. And so you see these, it's often hard to even understand what these fees mean. And some of them are not waivable by the judge at all. So the judges aren't lying when they say, sorry, there's nothing I can do. And the last one you see at the bottom there, well, actually not the very last one, well, the last couple of them have to do with once you pay everything that you have to pay for the ticket, according to the court, then you even after that have to pay a $45 fee to clear it off of your driver's license report. So, for example, if you have a ticket that is suspending your license, as we talked about earlier, if you have an unpaid ticket that you haven't paid within a certain amount of time, or if you missed a court date, that suspends your license. And so, even after you resolve that ticket, then you have to pay a $45 fee to the Secretary of State clear that off and to stop it from suspending your license so you can get your driver's license restored. And that is charged even if the ticket that you got was dismissed. So even if you go to court and you work out a deal with the prosecutor, or maybe you, through your own legal arguments, get the ticket dismissed, you still have to pay that $45 fee to the Secretary of State to unsuspend your license. So we can't just look at the fees. By the end of it, we see our clients often having to pay several $100s for a single traffic stop. And it is, of course, falling on people who are least able to pay it because, as we talked about earlier, they often got these tickets because they didn't have money in the first place. So it is, a real shakedown, by the system. And it pays off. And so you look at the costs that the courts collect, and this is just in costs. This is not in the fines. And you see they are, it's a lot of money. Detroit, $1 million. Dearborn, $435,000. And, that is, a lot of money, and that's without even the fines that people are paying for the actual ticket.
So
this
illustrates exactly a standard example that we really see with actual clients. And we're going to go into some client stories in a moment, but this just illustrates clearly what we see often. So driving while license suspended charge with arrest in an impounded car. The impound fee for the car might be $700. The bond, so the amount that you have to pay to essentially not go to jail and to get an arraignment hearing, a pretrial date to basically litigate your violation, can range from $100 to $500. In some courts, we've seen it as high as $7,500, 10%, so that's $750. Then you have the fine, which can be anywhere from $0 to $500. In this example, it was $350. Then you have court fees and court costs, which are two separate things. Then you have a warrant fee, which is often imposed if a warrant was ever issued. Maybe you failed to show up to court because you weren't even aware that you had a court date because you never received anything in the mail about the court hearing. Maybe you didn't have transportation because, again, your car is impounded, so you had no way to get there, especially if you don't live in Dearborn. And then you have a clearance fee. It's $45 per offense. It's worth noting the per offense aspect of this because oftentimes when a person is pulled over for driving with a suspended license, they may have something else like defective equipment. Maybe their brake light was out. Sometimes they're charged with, having a mirror, their view obstructed through like a air freshener or something like that. So one traffic stop essentially is what I'm saying can lead you to having multiple offenses on the same exact ticket. And so while you're there on the driving while license suspended charge, in order to get your license back and your license reinstated, you have to pay the court $45 per offense. And that also applies even if you're ultimately found not guilty of this offense, or if you're ultimately the case is dismissed, I should say. So many times the prosecutor will say, you know what, we'll throw this out. Even if they make that type of decision, you can still be charged $45 per offense from the court. So it's kind of a win-win situation in many ways because, for the court, because even if they pull someone over and ultimately the ticket is thrown out, if their license ever hits suspension status, the court is still making money off of this situation. And then the reinstatement fee of $125 is paid to the Secretary of State. So even after you paid all these other fees, you still don't have a valid driver's license unless you go to the Secretary of State and pay them an additional $125 to get your physical hard plastic license back. So it can be very daunting, especially if you have this exact situation in more than one court. So maybe you have this same situation in a Dearborn court and you have a ticket out of Detroit. You could have multiple suspensions in different jurisdictions, and you have to litigate each of those before you can go pay the $125 reinstatement fee at the Secretary of State. Joe, did you want to go to the next slide? I think you went one too far. Yep. So warrants and contempt procedures. Using arrests and jails to get money. Warrants for failing to appear in court are the #1 reason for arrest in Michigan. There are 29,295. That's the number of people arrested for failure to appear in Michigan. And what 1 day in jail for contempt is worth towards a person's debt is $10. And that's important to note because, again, if you have a large amount of fines and fees that you're owing, sometimes the court will say, well, you can choose jail or you can pay this off. Well, again, if you're only getting $10 worth of credit for each day that you spend in jail, you could do quite amount of time, a considerable amount of time, and it could disrupt your whole quality of life. There are tons of collateral consequences from being in jail, such as potentially losing custody of your children, if you're their primary or custodial parent, losing your job, losing your home. I mean, the consequences truly are endless, not to mention the actual stigma of having a criminal record. Too many times I've seen clients trying to pursue jobs and they can't get a job because they have a warrant, and can't pass a background check, or their employer is just raising an eyebrow because they're seeing so many misdemeanor offenses and not caring that they are traffic misdemeanors. It's still criminal offenses from their point of view. So these are just a few things to highlight. And Joe, did you want to talk about
Sure,
this?
yeah. Yeah, and as we said earlier, we see this in real life. We represent people who deal with these tickets and deal with traffic court every week. And so we have seen some pretty egregious examples of these problems in practice. I'll start with Miss S. She was my client. She was a woman who actually didn't get work for a long time because she got in a car accident and actually sustained some major head trauma. And so she could not find work. She was actually in the process of applying for Social Security disability. But in the course of doing that, she incurred some traffic tickets that she couldn't pay, and a couple of those in Dearborn. But the traffic tickets were driving on a suspended license, driving with expired tags, driving without proof of insurance. I think those were her tickets. And nothing to do with driving dangerously. And she wasn't able to pay those. And so a warrant was put out for her arrest. So next time she was driving through Dearborn, she got pulled over again, and the police officer arrested her. And this is a young mother, and again, who, is, I believe she was, picking up her children at the time on her way to, and she was arrested, put in lockup in the Dearborn criminal justice compound they have there, and her family had to come and actually bond her out. They bailed her out. She had to spend, luckily she didn't spend a night in jail, and she had to come back, and she had to get on a payment plan for several $100s, and we were able to get some of the tickets dismissed. But she was arrested and handcuffed and put in a police car and taken to a jail for simply the crime of being unable to pay traffic tickets, and unable to pay for car insurance, unable to pay the fee to renew your license plate. I think a lot of people don't understand what the majority, and thankfully the data that Accountability for Dearborn collected shows this, that the majority of policing in Dearborn, just as an example, is doing. It is not stopping murderers from attacking old ladies. It's harassing poor and Black people a lot. And of course, we didn't bring this up, but just always keep in mind that in any city budget, and Dearborn is especially egregious with this, the money allotted for policing is, of course, the largest line item, and cities spend a whole lot of money for police to pull people over and arrest them for things like that. Mr. B, he wasn't my client, but some of our colleagues at Detroit Justice Center shared their stories for us, even though they couldn't join us on the panel. He was pulled over in Dearborn. He's from Detroit. And he said that he was pulling out of a shopping center in Dearborn. I think it was well, I don't know for sure, but it was one of the shopping centers in Dearborn, and he saw a police car across the street from him, watching him. And so he knew that as a black man driving in Dearborn, he had to drive perfectly. And so because of that, he knew that he used his turn signal. When he was pulling out of the shopping center, he knows he uses his turn signal, but sure enough, as soon as he pulls out and drives in front of this police car, it turns on its lights and it pulls him over. And the police officer said that he didn't use his turn signal, and that was his justification for pulling him over. So once he did pull him over, he found that Mr. B had a suspended license from unpaid traffic tickets, and released and arrested him as well, and only released him after Mr. B paid a $500 bond to the city of Dearborn, and they gave him a court date. And Mr. B did not appear at the court date because he was afraid of getting held in jail again in Dearborn, because he knew he couldn't pay the entire amount that he owed, especially after paying that $500 bond, and especially on after working on some of his other tickets in other jurisdictions. So, and he had been held in Detroit previously on other traffic tickets, so he was especially wary of submitting himself to the court. So because he didn't show up for the court date, they issued an arrest warrant for him, and his license was, suspended, remained suspended. When he came to Detroit Justice Center, he owed $3,000 in unpaid tickets in Detroit. That's what resulted in his license being suspended. And almost all of that money was from a single initial ticket that he got that he was unable to pay, which of course suspended his license, and then he got pulled over for driving on a suspended license, and so on. And so once they got to court with one of our, I think Jeff from DJC represented him, they had an argument to get their ticket dismissed. And they told the prosecutor that for Dearborn, the city attorney for Dearborn. And the city attorney said, oh, well, okay, fine. You can make that argument to get your ticket dismissed. But if you do that, I'm going to bring a charge against you for the misdemeanor crime of absconding on bond because he didn't show up for that court date. And so feel free, you can get that, failure to use your turn signal dismissed, but I'm coming at you with a misdemeanor. And so because of that, and because Mr. B was worried about the judge in Dearborn, perhaps sentencing him to jail for the misdemeanor, Mr. B pled responsible to failure to use his turn signal, even though he actually did. So then we have, we can go to Miss M. I believe our colleague Rabina represented her. She was a Detroit resident who was driving in Dearborn after dropping her children off at school. She was driving her husband's car, who is a CPL holder, a concealed pistol license holder, and she didn't know that her husband had his gun in the glove box. And so when she was pulled over by Dearborn police for supposedly not wearing a seatbelt, but when we actually reviewed the dash cam footage, there was really no way this Dearborn police officer could have seen her seatbelt from his vantage point. So we believe that was a pretext for stopping Ms. M. But that was his pretext. And once he pulled her over, he ran her plate, found out that she was a Detroit resident with a suspended license, and promptly arrested her for driving on a suspended license. And again, this was a situation where she was unable to pay some tickets, and searched her car and found the gun in the glove box that she had no idea was there, charged her with a felony for the gun, and a misdemeanor for driving on a suspended license, and some civil infractions for no proof of insurance and expired registration. With our help, she was able to get her driver's license restored, but she ended up pleading and getting probation for the felony for the gun, which is forever on her record, simply because she didn't realize that her husband had this gun in the glove box. And so go down to Mr. G. He was a Detroit resident. He got a seasonal job in Dearborn. He was pulled over and arrested for not having car insurance and ticketed for no registration. And his initial court date was canceled due to the polar vortex. If you guys remember that happening, I think it was like the winter of 2019. And he didn't get a note. And so he was looking forward to going to that court date and making his arguments in court. But he got notice that it was canceled, but he didn't get a notice of the new court date. And so because of that, he did not go to the new court date. They did schedule one. They didn't notify him of it. And so an arrest warrant was issued for failure to appear. And so that's just an example of how easily an arrest warrant can be entered against someone for failure to make one court date for a charge that, really was nothing serious. I don't think a lot of people realize that, arrest warrants are issued for that kind of thing. But if you are a certain kind of person in Dearborn, they often are. And that is, and when we talk about arrest warrants and arresting people and requiring them to pay bond, this is leverage that cities like Dearborn use to make people afraid and to extract money from them. And because, of course, they get that bond, they can keep it if the person doesn't show up, or even if the person does show up, then they have to pay the tickets, and then they can apply the bond to the balance that the person owes for the tickets. And so they use this, arresting people and jailing people. And Dearborn is particularly bad with arresting people on traffic warrants. Some cities are less likely to do it. Even if they pull you over and they see that you have a bench warrant, some cities are less likely to arrest you because they see, well, this isn't a felony or anything where we won't arrest you for this. We won't, hold you in lockup. But Dearborn is one of those cities that people really do legitimately have to worry about that. And so they use that as a way to scare people into coughing up more money. Let's go to the next slide. So this does not have to happen. So you might see this and say, well, this is a bad system. This is unfortunate, but maybe it's inevitable. What can we do? Well, there's plenty of things cities can do. One thing that cities can do is stop enforcing low-level offenses like driving with a suspended license. There is no reason to charge someone with a misdemeanor crime or arrest them, put them in jail, or driving on a suspended driver's license, which, as we said, most of the time got suspended because they were unable to pay a traffic ticket. It's not, you might think maybe these people drank and drive or something like that. That's pretty rare. When you look at most suspensions, it's for failure to appear at a court date or failure to pay. And then you can also create non-police responses to a lot of these issues that we're talking about. So, for example, we talked in the beginning about tickets for equipment violations, as they call them. Well, and some cities in the country are experimenting with this to some success, which is the city, instead of penalizing someone who obviously can't afford to fix their car, I think most people, if they can afford to fix their side view mirror or their brake light, they will. So instead of penalizing someone for it and pulling them over and suspending their license, you can give them a voucher. You can spend some city money to enable them to pay for those repairs instead of threatening them with jail time. You can order the city attorney to stop prosecuting minor offenses. None of this is required. A city attorney, even after we have the police officers who have their own discretion on what they pull people over for, what they ticket people for, what they arrest people for, and even after that, the city attorney has discretion on what they prosecute people for. And so the city could very easily direct their city attorney, who is their employee, who decides whether or not to charge people for most of these offenses, to stop prosecuting people for certain offenses that have nothing to do with public safety. And this last one is important to what we were talking about earlier, which is instead of conditioning court funding on how much money the court is able to extract from poor people, you condition court funding on reducing fines and fees and ending the practice of issuing warrants for minor charges. And you could use the power of the purse that the city has for good instead of evil. And these are all things that are very easy to track. The court already tracks them. And so the city could say to the court, stop issuing bench warrants for people who fail to pay an equipment violation ticket for longer than 3 months. That is a waste of city resources to have police officers arresting people and holding people in jail for that kind of thing. And so these are just some of the things cities can do, and I'm sure you can think of other things. Judges can waive existing debt and set fines proportional to the ability to pay. So as we talked about, there's a Michigan court rule that already sets forth the process for doing this. If someone comes to the court and has 7 or 8 tickets built up, mostly for tickets that have nothing to do with public safety, a judge can waive the old debt. Some people have very old tickets dating back from like 2004, 2005, 2012. A judge, no matter what is charged or what someone is guilty of, a judge using their discretion can waive the old debt and say, you know what, this doesn't serve the community, requiring you to pay this. I'm not going to require you to pay it. Stop issuing warrants for unpaid debt or failure to appear. We already talked about that. And dismiss charges en masse. So judges can just say, you know what, even if the city prosecutor is charging these people for these stupid offenses that really have nothing to do with public safety, I am not going to issue sentences for them. I'm not going to convict people based on them. The judge completely has the discretion to do that as well. So, we really, we're attorneys and we do what we can, but we know that often these decision makers, as they were referred to earlier, tend to listen to people that live in these communities, their constituents, their taxpayers. So it is extremely helpful to have groups like Accountability for Dearborn, and there are other groups in other suburbs as well, to pressure their own city governments and to let them know that, hey, we think this is a problem and we want you to change this. So you can look at how much money does your city spend on traffic enforcement and other law enforcement that punishes poor people. That is, your tax dollars. That is your property tax revenue being spent on harassing poor people, harassing Black and brown people, and extracting money from them. How much revenue does your city earn from traffic enforcement, driving while license suspended, and other fines and fees? So, when you look at, how many people get hired to work at the courts, how many police officers get hired, new fancy court buildings that get built, were those built with money extracted from people that got pulled over for ridiculous stuff, for racist and anti-poor reasons? What other laws do your police enforce that are about poverty, not safety? So we just listed some of them. There are many more, and they might differ depending on the city. So look yourself. Cities have their own code of ordinances publicly available on the internet. You can look yourself and say, should this be a crime? Should this be even a civil infraction that somebody gets ticketed for? And if it isn't, then we should change it. What laws could you immediately stop enforcing, without any cost to public safety? Because even if something's a state law, and a lot of these are indirectly or directly, adopt what's called the Motor Vehicle Code, which is sort of a statewide code. But even if they do that, they can still choose to enforce certain things and to not enforce other things. And so what of these offenses can your city just immediately stop enforcing with no cost to the actual community safety? What solutions could your community offer to poverty with money saved from policing? Jobs programs, housing assistance. And this is important because I think when we talk about, defunding police, we often talk about it solely as a negative, but keep in mind that every dollar that doesn't go to policing can then go to something else that actually solves the problems that are often leading to these offenses, so-called offenses. And so we already talked about vouchers for car repairs. We could have jobs programs to help people actually get jobs so that they can pay for their car to be fixed, pay for their car insurance, pay for the many costs that go into registration and having a driver's license, housing assistance. And so, thinking positively about not just defunding, but refunding, and reinvesting in the community. I think that's a very important thing that we at DJC talk about a lot. Go to the next slide, and I think this is yours, Erin.
Yep. So a major point is just that it's happening elsewhere, right? We could follow suit in a positive way in these positive trends that are happening in other municipalities. So we copied and pasted a couple headlines that we've seen that kind of symbolize this. One says, San Francisco ends poverty penalty, clears all driver's license suspensions for people who miss traffic court dates. Hennepin County deputies to hand out repair vouchers, not tickets. Instead of fix-it tickets, deputies will now hand out vouchers to help pay for repairs. Pritzker signs law ending driver's license suspension over unpaid parking tickets. So the point of this slide was just to demonstrate truly we can do something about this. This is not far-fetched. And again, it's important to understand that if you don't think bigger, you can't have bigger. You can't have better. So I think too often we're limiting our own dreams about what we could have for our society instead. And it really requires embracing kind of our imagination on these topics. On defunding to reinvest. So Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, city officials cutting $100 million to $150 million from LAPD budget funds to be reinvested in communities of color. Minneapolis City Council resolves to replace police with community-led model. Denver School Board votes unanimously to remove police from public schools. So this is just showing, again, the kind of defunding to reinvest. It's the idea that we don't have to just spend our money on things that look like incarceration or further the carceral state. Also, I think it's important to note that we can have a safer society if we defund and reinvest. Too often, we like to, defund, but then not invest those funds in evidence-based programming and evidence-based models that actually better our communities as a whole and allow crime to desist, allow, people holistically within a society to thrive and do better. It's one thing to close a jail, but it's another thing to close a jail and then create jobs and then create accessible education, then create affordable housing. I think the two really have to go hand in hand. It can't just be one or the other. So those are just a couple points to make. I saw a couple questions in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. So one person said, I thought bond was used when people were at risk for flight. Can you comment on this? So it's really important to note that in the traffic court context, that just is not the case. Yes, bond historically was supposed to be used for flight, but one thing that's important to note is that bond does not actually prevent someone from flight. It doesn't make them less likely to flee. Those things are worth noting. In the traffic court context, is often used more so as a gatekeeping mechanism. So for example, if you miss a court date, right? Let's say you were arrested for driving with a suspended license. You paid bond 2 hours later at the police station. You were never even transferred to a county jail. And then you didn't appear at the court date because maybe you never got the notice. Maybe you're actually living out of your car and you're homeless, so there was nowhere for them to even mail a valid notice to, right? When you finally get on your feet, maybe you come to the Detroit Justice Center asking for help. Many times when you contact the court and say, hey, I'd like to clear a warrant, or here's the situation, like I'd like to come in and resolve my matter. Many times what will happen is the court will say, oh, well, your client can come in, but there's a $900 bond that's been imposed. Now, technically, bond is not supposed to be set before an individualized determination can be made as to whether not only is this person a flight risk, but also, whether this bond amount is it's such an insurmountable barrier to them being able to access the court that it's actually unfair. And, ability to pay is supposed to be assessed. Employment is supposed to be assessed. All these additional factors are supposed to be assessed in this individualized determination. But too often courts just set a blanket threshold of this is what the bond is. And so a lot of the time that keeps people from being able to pay it. And then even in instances where people are not a flight risk, sometimes what will happen is that the court will just, again, standardize bond and many times courtroom counsel is, you know, they're very familiar with the judges and they're very familiar with the prosecutors, and they won't push back at all. They'll just be like, the judge will say, does $200 sound right for bond? And they'll be like, yes, Your Honor. And that'll be it. They won't lean over to the client and say, like, you know, what's your situation? And so a lot of times it just requires zealous advocacy to actually have attorneys that are comfortable doing their job despite the other players in the room, who can say, like, no, Your Honor, actually that's too high for this client. He has been on disability for the last 10 years. He's homeless. Like, that's just not going to work. So I think that that matters. Another question that's in the chat is, who sets the fee schedule and what is the determining factor for arresting an individual? So two really important things about that. The fee schedule, Joe mentioned that some ordinances are enacted by the cities or municipalities themselves to mirror the motor vehicle code. So it's you know, federal legislation, or I'm sorry, state legislation that is then adopted or to mirror what the state has done. So the state creates some laws, the city council may adopt similar laws that mirror the state's version of those laws. And as a result, they set a fee schedule that also mirrors what the state has set. And sometimes the city council just sets the fee schedule. So it's worth noting that. The determining factor for arresting an individual is truly up to the police officer's discretion, and that is what makes it sometimes so frustrating. So an important example might be a person has a ticket they can't afford to pay for defective equipment. Their tail light was out, they never paid that ticket. The court sends them what's called a show cause notice, basically saying it's been X amount of days, why haven't you paid this money? Keep in mind, defective equipment is not a misdemeanor. It's a civil infraction, no different than a speeding ticket. The person doesn't show up to court when they receive that show cause notice for the defective equipment ticket. And as a result, a warrant is issued for their arrest. Literally then, when that person is driving later, the officer might pull them over and see that the only ticket they have, and the only reason they have a warrant is because of this defective equipment ticket, which is a civil ticket in nature, but then could literally choose on his discretion to arrest this person and take them to jail for something that is a civil ticket. So I think that that is important to note, is that it's completely discretionary. And again, it matters because oftentimes a person's implicit bias or the implicit bias of the officer may lead them to say, oh no, you're going to jail, versus if it were, you know, a white woman pulled over, they might be like, oh ma'am, like this happens all the time, have a nice day. So that part makes it very challenging to like track some of this stuff. Would it be beneficial to try and get fines changed to community service and to make that standard to make the standard form for major fines? So that's an interesting proposition, but I think an important thing to know in terms of converting things to community service is that there's a common misconception that community service is always better and that a person can always do community service. I know I myself fell guilty to that assumption, and now I always ask the client, you know, is community service something that you can actually do? Because again, you don't have childcare needs. Sometimes that makes it impossible to do community service. Sometimes the same transportation problems that make it difficult for the person to get to work because they can't use their car, can't drive, make it impossible for them to get to community service. Sometimes they have to work, so they can't do the community service in the allotted time that is offered. So I think that there's you know, sometimes we're privileged and we don't think that, you know, we think community service is like, oh, you don't have to pay anything. That's, you know, should be better, but sometimes it can be more daunting for an individual depending on their circumstance.
Yeah, can I talk just briefly on that, Aaron? Because I think in Dearborn in particular, we don't often realize what community service entails. So for example, in Dearborn, when a judge talks about community service, they're talking about a very specific thing, which is Dearborn's own work program. And you might have seen them on the sides of the road. They are people that are taken on a bus. They have to show up, I think, before 7 a.m. To the court. And they haven't been doing it lately because of coronavirus, but back when they were doing it, I'm sure they will again soon, you have to show up, I think, before 7 a.m. to the court. you all get in a bus and you pick up garbage on the side of the road, in jumpsuits, and you and it might be bad weather, and you might not have the right kind of body for that, and you do that for several hours. And I had a client who was a young woman who got, I believe, 3 tickets, and again, none of them had anything to do with driving dangerously. I don't remember the exact tickets, but there's some of the ones we talked about earlier. And a judge sentenced her, and she had no money, absolutely no income. And the judge said to her, well, okay, fine. I won't sentence you to pay anything. I'll sentence you to spend 5 days with the work program. And so that's 5 days of showing up in a city that she doesn't live in. And keep in mind, she can't drive legally before 7 a.m. and to pick up garbage on the side of the road. Do you think that's, a fair thing to require someone to do for tickets that really just criminalize poverty? So I agree with Erin that, in some situations, community service can be a better option for someone rather than requiring them to pay fines or fees. But when we're talking about these offenses, the most fair option for most of them is to require people to do nothing at all and to, in fact, help them fix their problems that are leading them to not be able to afford these issues.
Yeah, I think the key here is, again, safety, right? For many people, this does not make our community safer. Like, these types of offenses, people will say often, like when we've talked to legislators and, we've had these really passionate conversations with them, and they'll say sometimes, don't people need to have an incentive to not break the law? Don't they need to have an incentive to not drive with a broken windshield or not drive with a faulty tail light or to get car insurance? And it's like, honestly, I really want people to sit with this as we kind of wrap things up. If you could afford to not, quote unquote, drive dirty, if you could afford to have car insurance to protect yourself should you get in an accident, wouldn't you have car insurance? If you could afford to get your tail light fixed, why would you want the hassle of driving in the dark where, we're in Michigan, it gets dark at 5 o'clock. Why would you want to drive around not being able to see? Why would you want to drive around with your kids in the car with a cracked windshield that could explode on them? Like, you wouldn't want to do any of this. And so I just think it blows my mind or boggles my mind in a way that people think we need to incentivize, individuals to not break the law. I think it literally comes down to dollars and cents. If we could pay people instead to just fix their, fix a lot of their vehicle malfunctions, we wouldn't even have these challenges. So thank you for listening to us ramble and for being so present and asking such great questions. We really appreciate it and we enjoyed participating. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your wonderful insights. We do have just a couple more items to get through. I want to assure anybody that needs to hop off because of scheduling or life that this is being recorded. You'll be receiving a link to the recording. So, if you have to drop off now, no worries, you're not going to miss anything. So accountability for Dearborn's recommendations specific for our community really surround this transparency, accountability, divestment, investment framework. Now, these aren't all of our recommendations. These are the recommendations that are supported by the conversations that we've been having today. So we want to look at increased transparency from our police department. It was a lot to get these data. It was a lot of work. It took us about 6 months of pressuring our city government to release these data. And that should not have been the case, but it was. Also, it's time for our police department to start recording the ethnic identities of those stopped so that we can trace all forms of discrimination and recognize patterns in those forms. Accountability really looks like civilian oversight to review officer misconduct as well as departmental data. The reality is that this work that Accountability for Dearborn has been doing is volunteer work from just everyday people. And it's a lot of work, and we don't have consistent access to the information that we need. And at some point, we need to see city leadership listening to thought leaders who have devoted a portion of their time and a portion of their lives to understanding this in a department that has power, like subpoena power, to be able to gain access to data, as well as the ability to inform policy decisions within our city. And I should clarify there that when I say policy, I'm referring to budgetary decisions, legislative decisions, as well as administrative policies. And then divestment. So defunding policing that causes harms and targets and murders Black people. And then investing, those proactive solutions to minimize the criminalization of poverty, funding non-police responders, and also just ongoing scrutiny of all city operations. The reality is that while the police department is one of the mechanisms that Dearborn's government uses to uphold racial segregation and to push a racist agenda, it's not the only one. And we need to come to understand health disparities in our city. We need to come to understand transportation disparities in our city. We need to understand economic disparities. The reality is that that takes investment from our city and a commitment from our city to be able to understand how all of those pieces come together.
All right, so we are now closing out. Thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you for sticking through and listening to all these numbers and stories. They're extremely important, and we really hope that you take them to heart and make sure that you are integrating anti-racism into your life every single day. And we also invite you to join us if this is work that you'd like to be a part of. There's so many different ways that you can plug in, and I'm sure it's the same with the DJC. I saw that they're looking for interns, and we're also looking for anyone who's interested in participating. And a huge shout out to Aaron and Joe and the DJC for helping us bring this together. You guys are extremely invaluable. And a huge shout out to everybody behind the scenes that made this come together. Thank you so much, and thank you, Beth. So yeah, I'm going to now formally invite you to the upcoming data town halls. We have one on December 19th at 6 o'clock, also at on a Saturday. So they're spread out pretty much every single month. So if you can remember, a month from now I should hear from accountability, check in with us. So town hall number 2, we have town hall number 3, January 16th, and town hall number 4, February 20th. So we invite you to that. Yeah. And we hope to keep seeing you, and check in wherever you need. Thank you very much, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.